All right, well, that was awesome. Thanks, Kathleen. That was a really nice update. Very easy to follow. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a little bit about exploration and discovery. I've worked on all the things, most of the things that Kathleen has worked on with ash through my time. But started to go in a slightly different direction just about 10 years ago. So, this is my intro stuff. But this is, remember what ash trees used to look like? This is like green ash in the fall. You have the purples of white ash and so forth. Until that came around. You just heard all about that, so I won't go over that. And that really changed the landscape. And I was part of a team. I remember giving a talk in here in around 2008 or 9. I don't know if you were here or not, Kathleen. It was when the metro parks were deciding what to do about the EAB issue. But should we treat trees? Should we not? How many? Where? And so forth. And so it's been, 15, 18 years ago, right? I was standing here in that meeting. But for a while, it's like bad news. We kind of knew what was going on here in the eastern U.S. It was kind of bad news for ash. And then I think a lot of people sort of relaxed and turned their attention to other things. Some groups continue to study it, like us and Kathleen's group and a handful of others. But a lot of people turn to other things. But I'd say in the last couple of years, it's picked up again, partly because EAB has reached the west coast of the U.S. In Oregon as of 2022, excuse me. Okay, and so this is an Oregon ash in Forest Grove outside of Portland, where this EAB was first discovered, moving it now to the west coast, becoming also a west coast problem. All right, well, if you saw in my little intro there, I'm going to talk about white fringetree and olive trees today, primarily. Okay, and that may seem like a sudden switch or segue. And why is that? Well, again, after having worked on the ash issue for a while, I always had in the back of my mind about host switching or alternate hosts for EAB, or what else could this thing possibly eat? Okay? We thought it was an ash specialist, and that's the only behaviors it had been displaying as far as anybody knew. But, introduce here white fringetree. Raise your hand if you know white fringetree. A handful of you. If you turn around and look at the other side of the pond, you can't see it from here necessarily, but there's one right across the bridge there. There's several around these ponds. There's about 13 of them lining the drive right up to the main building. And so they're all around here. They have these brilliant fringe-like flowers in mid-May, after all the viburnums and dogwoods are done, then they tend to flower. So they're a beautiful ornamental tree. They are native to Ohio, far southern Ohio, but they are planted ornamentally well outside of their native range. They're mostly a southeastern tree. And it turns out to be a close relative of ash trees. So I thought, well, if there's a good candidate for an alternate host for EAB, it would be this tree. It's a close relative of ash. It's not an ash tree. It's in the same family. And so I had a weekend to myself at home in Yellow Springs and decided to take a walk and take a look at some white fringe trees I knew existed in Yellow Springs. This is the Little Miami River Bike Trail. Some of you have probably been on this bike trail before. And there's several of these that have been planted by the local tree committee through the years. And I thought, okay, this is the day. I'm going to take a walk and I'm going to take a look at these trees and see if there's any evidence of EAB attacking the tree. And if you take a look at that tree versus that one, you can already see, right? If you look at it, it's pretty weak looking, right? And so, and this is right beside the bike trail. And of course, when you get up close to it, there was an EAB exit hole, EAB, I believed, okay, right in front of me. Anybody in the world could have seen this if they just stopped and taken a look. It just happened to be me. I just was curious. And I got permission to cut into this tree and ultimately cut this tree down. And when I did that, you could see that's the gallery underlying that exit hole. In parts of the tree, there were live larvae I could find, and lots of old and new galleries. but I didn't have an adult. I wasn't sure, and the USDA really required me to be sure that this was EAB before they became convinced. And so I cut this tree down, debarked the whole thing, assessed it. About 6 weeks later, it dried, and this crack opened up in the wood. And inside that crack was a beetle, an adult that had gone through, pupation, but it never made it back out of the tree. It just got stuck in there. It died without getting out. And I dug that thing out, and I sent it along to the USDA insect identifiers, and it was confirmed as emerald ash borer. Okay, so this became then the first non-ash host for emerald ash borer ever recorded, leading to this paper, and my world sort of flipped upside down for a while. Okay, so we ran with this for a number of years after that, okay, starting right then. This paper was not based on just that one tree. I sampled several trees in the Dayton region, starting out in that study, from in Yellow Springs in Dayton down here. That tree right there is the one I'm referring to on the other side of the pond. Okay, this tree, that picture was on the cover of the Dayton Daily News one year after this discovery was announced, because it was one of the trees I knew existed and I examined in my studies that was infested by EAB. Right, and I'll tell you what happened with that in just a second. Okay, well that's one thing that happened. All right, later, the one thing we hadn't seen yet at that point was watched any live EAB come out of the trees. We saw all the signs and symptoms, and I even found a dead adult in one of them. But we never watched a live one come out of there. And that's like the ultimate evidence, right? So what we did here then is, I got permission. I worked with a guy named Rich Pearson. I think he's long retired now here at the Metro Parks. We cut that tree down, left a couple of stems that were healthy, standing right there. Okay, all these were cut. And then we took these branches, these stems, into an incubation facility and overwintered them, and then just let whatever come out of them would come out of them. Okay, and we indeed got live adults to walk out of those branches a few months later. Okay, you see this was in like February when I collected them. I think it was in early April when they came out in this incubation facility. Okay, so at that point then, we ran around the whole sort of Midwest looking for white fringe trees in gardens, in people's yards, in arboreta, parks, what have you. It was fun. It was discovering, finding like detective work, right? Finding out, first of all, where are there white fringe trees, then going to look at them and see if we can find any evidence of EAB attack on those things. In any case, this is just a map of sites, just showing you around the Midwest, where we had found in a series of our studies where EAB had attacked white fringe trees. And again, most of these dots isn't just a single tree. That might be a site that has anywhere from 5 to 30 trees, and that just means that there were some number found to be attacked there. I think over all of our studies at this time, and this was a paper published in 2019, we had about, 170, 180 trees in this inventory. About 30% of them had been attacked. Okay, that was our number, about 30%. Now, what we found, however, in 2 studies of this large range, and this has to do with the fate of the trees. Okay, so they get attacked at some somewhat low rate, but they do get attacked. They are susceptible, clearly. But what happens to them? Do they suffer the same fate as ash trees? And so this was a study that comes from, again, this Ellison 2019 paper, where the first one was our first demonstration of the inventory. We ran around for a year sampling trees just to get an assessment of what their status was, whether they were attacked or not, their health, using some of the same health indicators that Kathleen talked about for ash. And then Emily Ellison and I went back a few years later to see how they were doing, okay, after the second time around. And there's some minutia in here, but what you can glean from this is that these are all ornamentally planted trees, low density plantings, just like they are here, okay? At Attack rate generally declined across this time period from what we had seen the first time to the second time. Canopy health of the trees generally improved as the EAB kind of abandoned the trees. And remember, this is corresponding to the loss of all the ash trees in the area at the same time, okay, which reduces the EAB density. So things get better as long as the EAB density goes down, because the ashes were being lost. It was rare for us to find a tree, a white fringe tree, killed by EAB directly, okay, but they did suffer a lot of aesthetic problems. You know, they're a multi-stem tree. You can have one or two branches affected while the rest of the tree is fine. So overall tree mortality was rare in this study, but we did find that some trees get removed in managed situations like this just because they start to look bad. In some cases, they get removed and people never realized what was killing them. And if they had only looked carefully, they would also have seen this. So we saw that many times. Okay, so that's what we were seeing in this time frame here. And then I didn't do much. My lab and I didn't do much on this story for a few years. Okay, and then of course the pandemic was in the middle of all that. But you know, kind of got re-interested in what's happening with the white fringe trees again. And I went out on, this is June 2022 now, the same bike trail. Looks like the same tree almost that I showed you before, but that tree was cut down to be barked. This is a different set of white fringe trees. And as you can see, there's dieback on this tree, all right? And I'm like, huh, that kind of looks like it's being attacked again, or still being attacked. And yes, looking carefully at those branches, there were adult exit holes there. This is what the tree looked like in 2023, okay? And this illustrates the variation that Kathleen talked about that you can sometimes see. You see it even more in white fringe trees. Here's one that's heavily attacked by EAB. This one was not attacked at all. It was perfectly fine, right beside it, right? So what causes that? You know, it's just an interesting question. So that led me to kind of take a look back at some of our study sites and see what was going on after we had not really looked at them for 4 or 5 years. And that, in particular, led me to this site, a site at Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest in Vinton County. And the key about this site is we were able to find a wild population of white fringe trees. Okay? Everything we had studied up to that point was mostly ornamentally planted trees, in many cases in managed or semi-managed situations. We wanted to know what was happening in the wild, with wild trees, and in a forested situation. And so, and we also got to this. Moreover, all those other studies were done kind of retrospectively. You know, we started looking at those trees several years after they had started being attacked, so we couldn't really know what shape they were in before they were attacked and things like that. This one we got to before the EAB got there. All right, so there was this wild population. If you've ever been to Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest, I don't imagine many of you have, but you drive up this little forest road and there's a spot right here that has about 30, 40 white fringe trees large enough to include in a study like that, above these criteria that Kathleen talked about of attackable sizes. So in 2015, we set up a little monitoring study. Only 32 trees were in this study, 3 to 7 centimeters in diameter. And also set up 15 white ash trees in the vicinity to look at as well. 10 overstory large ones and 5 understory that were roughly about the size of the white fringe trees that were in the study. And we looked at all the signs and symptoms of EAB attack on these trees for several years, actually, all right? So we set it up in fall of 2015. We saw the first adult exit holes on white fringe trees, these wild white fringe trees, in the summer of 2017. That means that the beetles started to attack these trees probably in 2016, at minimum, okay, 2016, because they do this in their second season, right? They come out as adults in their second season. But here were the dynamics then. This is the proportion of trees in our study attacked by EAB through time. We set it up in 2015 when nothing showed any sign of attack, and followed it for the following 4 years. And these are the ash trees that we had set up. You can see by 4 years later, over 80% of them had been attacked by that point. And the fringe trees took a little bit longer to get started, but after that they started to rise. Their attack on them started to rise as well. Right? We also hung traps, like Kathleen talked about, just to see what beetle dynamics were like. And this wasn't done in a super systematic way, just to give us an indicator. But you can see that the beetle densities were pretty high by that first year. It's like they all just started to emerge from ash trees, were very abundant for a couple of years, and then it declined to pretty low levels by the end of this study. Okay, so this was a trap hung right in an ash tree. This was a trap hung right in a white fringe tree. So they find it, but they're not as don't catch as many. Of course, they're smaller trees as well too. This was hung in a large ash tree. But basically, the attack follows the densities, and this is particularly true for white fringe tree. It's more likely to get attacked when there are a lot of beetles around, and when the beetles kind of go away because the ash trees get killed and they go away, and beetles go down, then attack on them goes down. All right, that was through 2019. And given what I had seen in Yellow Springs at this tree that was being attacked here recently, I went back to this site in Vinton Furnace, okay, that in 2022, 23, took a look at these things, which represented 8 years post-establishment of the study, 2015. Okay, my first stop in winter of 2023 was just to go look at the status of the trees that were in the study. And here's one that just shows a lot of this is an old gallery from several years prior on a dead stem of a white fringe tree. I could show you this on a white fringe tree right out here, right now. Here's a tree showing what we call epicormic sprouting, right? So the release of lateral buds giving rise to branches all over the place, which is an indicator that there's some damage going on in the vascular tissue above that point. That's a sign of attack. There was active woodpecker activity. And I think maybe most of you know that if you see that on an ash tree, that usually means there are EAB larvae in there that the woodpeckers are going after. All right, so that was a sign that there were still current larvae in there. All right, so I went back to formally take a look at all the trees I could find in the plot in the summer of 2023. And here's just peeling into the bark of one, showing there's a gallery with a lot of fresher grass in it. There's a current year exit hole, okay, on one of the larger trees in the plot. And here was the summary of what I found. Okay, we had set up 32 trees originally. I only was able to relocate 27 for some reason. I think some of them actually died and fell down. But I had recorded it in 2019. We had seen up to that point that about 30% of the white fringe trees were attacked in the plot by 2019. By 2023, 65% of them showed evidence that they were attacked at some point. Not necessarily currently, but they had been attacked at some point throughout this study. 15% of those had current attack. They were still being attacked. There were EABs still in the plot, hanging on these trees. Trees that were not attacked, and there were some never attacked, they had a pretty good health score. Remember, lower, better, higher, worse. Previously attacked trees were middling. Okay? They were kind of showing signs of canopy thinness and decline, stem dieback. And we did see some mortality. About 7% of them were dead. Okay? Even though they are multi-stemmed, the whole tree died. And I went back in 2024, and there were a few more added to that in 2024. All of the larger ash trees we had marked by then were dead. But the understory ash were sort of showing a dynamic like the white fringe trees. And again, these were ash trees of a similar size. They were all showed signs that they had been attacked, but most of them, if not all, were living. Okay, so they were still hanging in there, but I don't know that that would persist. Okay? So just to kind of summarize, can fringe trees, not only what's their fate, but can they serve as a refuge? That's a concept like, if all ash trees, or most of the ash trees go away, and a handful start to grow back, and we do work on reintroduction efforts, will the handful of white fringe trees that are out there serve as a source for new beetles to reinfest them? And, in a plot like this, where after 8, now 9 years or so since we first started to look at it, actually this summer, the end of fall, will be 10 years since we set up that study, the trees are still there for the most part. There's still a handful of beetles in those trees. Potentially, they could serve as a refuge. This is just kind of a summary. Canopy health of attacked trees was poor, low but not no mortality, some tree death, and other signs of stress. So there was infestation for a long time. Again, this was a little plot as well. Only 32 trees in this study. And the more, the deeper into the native range of white fringe tree, they grow more abundantly in larger populations. And so even though any individual white fringe tree can only host maybe or yield a few adult beetles, if you have a large population of white fringe trees, then maybe that can be a significant refuge for the beetles. And of course the ashes, depending on what happens to them, they will keep producing beetles as well until they get killed or whatever happens to them. So there is potential for fringe trees, given that they generally don't die, to be a source of beetles, a refuge for EAB, which is not a good thing. Now, a lot of people ask, and I know there's some people in here that ask, should I plant a white fringe tree? These are beautiful trees, okay? They're very, they're a native tree. They are relatively resistant. Some of them are susceptible. Some could be damaged to the point of dying. But back to this tree across the pond, remember I showed you the picture where we cut it down? That tree looks pretty much like it did when I first looked at it, if you go look at it right now. Okay, it's large, many stems have grown back. You can manage white fringe trees sort of like you do with lilacs, other relatives in the family. You can cut them down to the ground, and they sprout profusely from the roots or stumps. So even if your tree does get attacked, you can manage it. You can manage the tree through the attack usually. Okay? And the beetles generally don't attack very small trees. So if you plant a small pot, 6-inch pot or a gallon pot, it's going to be a long time before that white fringe tree is of an attackable size. So you have time. So I suggest people still plant. and of course, just a handful of them here and there isn't really going to contribute to the maintenance of a large eagle population. Okay? All right, so that's the fringe tree story. And that's a local story. Let me tell you a story about olives now. That seems like an abrupt transition, right? And so why would I be talking about olives? So, well, first of all, what are olives? I think you all know. It's a Mediterranean tree, native to the Mediterranean basin, planted all around the world, wherever it will grow, which is kind of, the Mediterranean climates. Here in the U.S., it's in California, places like that. It's planted in South America, in Australia, in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and so forth. People think of it as a tropical tree. It's not. It's a tree of Mediterranean climates. It does need to be cooled down for part of the year. It has a chilling requirement for flowers to form normally, even though it is an evergreen tree. It's got to be chilled for a couple of months. And there are just hundreds of cultivated genotypes that vary in fruit size, and quality, and chemistry, and all that stuff. Right? All right, now, why talk about it? Cultivated olive is very closely related to white fringe tree. And white fringe trees, in fact, make fruits that are very similar to these, if you've seen them before. So, shortly after we started to work on the white fringe tree story, we started to ask questions about olive. Is it susceptible? And you're used to these kinds of scenes with olive cultivation. Here's an olive orchard. I keep hitting the wrong thing. in Tuscany. So that's a scene I witnessed last summer. But here in the US and in other places, we have the same kinds of scenes in California, in Oregon, this will be essential here, in parts of Florida, Georgia. Here's a tree growing in Kew Gardens in London, right? In the ground. People don't think about that, but you can grow olive trees in the ground in the UK. Thank you, Jetstream. Right? All right, so we became curious, and then moreover, remember that picture I showed you near the beginning that they found EAB in Forest Grove, Oregon, outside of Portland? That's right here. Okay, that's within about 10 kilometers of commercial olive orchards in Oregon. Olives are grown in Oregon, south of Portland, west and south of Portland. What this is overlying as well is the range of Oregon ash, which is a highly susceptible ash species. Again, what they discovered EAB infesting out there, which dives right into the heart of the olive growing regions throughout Oregon, but also into California. These are the major olive growing regions of California. And you can see that Oregon ash just dives right through the middle of that, which I indicate because Oregon ash and other like susceptible white and green ashes planted ornamentally will be the conduit to get EAB down there into olive growing regions so that they come into contact. So it's going to happen soon. The two will be in the wild soon, and we will see what happens out there. Okay. And this is just proof. This is a commercial olive orchard. It's called Red Ridge. It's a winery and olive grove, and that's an ash tree right there, really right in the orchard. Okay, and there's Oregon ashes all around. So these kinds of things will bring EAB, attract EAB right to olive groves soon. So we started to ask a series of questions. You could consider a sort of a risk assessment process to figure out if EAB is going to become a problem for olives, which is now a global issue, right? The first one is, can EAB even possibly feed and grow on olive stems? So let's take you through the very first experiment. This goes all the way back to 2015. We acquired these small olive trees from a nursery in Georgia, 5 varieties. Some of these, this is a very widely planted variety, Arbequina. Mission is a California variety, and then some French and Spanish varieties. Just potted them up, grew them for a couple months or a month, and then, like Kathleen described, you can inoculate trees artificially with eggs that are supplied by a laboratory where the adults lay their eggs usually on coffee filters, and then you just kind of have to tape them or paste the filter onto the bark. The egg will hatch, the larvae will enter the stem, and you can find out what happens after some period of time. So this was a totally exploratory, not many trees, 5 varieties, stuck a few eggs on them to see what happened. Okay, and so this is my colleague John Steyerman and a student of mine, Chad Rigsby, who I'm going to see on Friday actually, exploring one of the stems that in this little study, these were also small, right, little pencil diameter type of stems, under a scope after we've debarked it. Okay, and what they're looking at on the screen right there was a live and living feeding emerald ash borer larva. This is about after 2.5 weeks of feeding. So that was one of those like, sort of like holy crap, but also wow, both like these, there's something going on here that we need to follow up on. It's probably maybe not good news, but we need to follow up on it, right? So we continued. We did another bioassay similar to this, got similar results, enough for us to keep looking. And again, when you debark the tree like this to examine things, the experiment ends. So these are little short-term experiments on small trees. This was a more definitive bioassay. Using small stems like that, they don't last long, they dry out eventually. You try to keep them moist, but you cannot do a bioassay for very long. So in this one, this is now moving from February to October of 2016, following year. we got some larger stems from trees grown in a commercial olive orchard from California, a place called Lemon Cove. It's right here in this county. And the variety we got was called Manzanilla. And that's the one that everybody likes stuffed with pimentos. All right, so that's Manzanilla, the variety. And again, these stems now from this tree were on the order of this. Much bigger, thicker bark, longer lasting. And our goal here was to try to let the larvae feed and grow for as long as possible and see if we could get adults to come out of these trees. So we did the same thing. These are the stems standing up in a container. We cut them to lengths like this. These are the eggs, or you can't see it here, but these are like the strips of stuff we use to adhere the eggs to the bark. And this is just to show you that the stems are alive. You know, they're not. This is not an intact tree, but the stems are alive. They'll even leaf out. You know, they'll leaf out and try to grow for a while. So it's not like they're dead logs. They're still alive. All right. So we inoculated 17 stem sections, and of all the eggs we put on them, I think we put on about 80 eggs or so. We got 61 of those eggs to hatch. So that's our starting point. We had 60 eggs hatched, and the larvae started to drill into that bark. There's my student, Donnie Peterson, debarking some stems. We took some of those stems periodically and debarked them. And of course, you take them out of the experiment when you do that, but we just want to see what was happening. So this is Donnie peeling a stem to see what's happening, and we started to see that. Okay, so this now is a larva that's probably more about 30 days old. Okay, you can see it's doing the same thing it does on ash trees, the same thing we see it could do on white fringe trees, and we kept going. Okay, here's several weeks later, the next level of development. These are larvae in their last instar, drilling their way to form a prepupal chamber, their overwintering chamber. Okay, so they were surviving. We were seeing them survive long enough to chew into the bark and make a prepupal chamber. So what we did then, we debarked a lot of stems along that progression, but we saved 3 stems, intact stems. You can see them standing upright in this barrel here. And on those stems, there had been 19 successful egg hatches. So theoretically, 19 larvae entered those stems. What we had to do is take them through an artificial winter. We cooled them down, gave them the chilling thing, and then brought them back up. And what that does is induce the larvae to pupate, to go through their pupation. They need a chilling period to go through pupation to emerge as an adult in the spring. So we did this artificially in an incubator. We were just about to give up. Then we brought the trees back, the stems back out, put them at room temperature, and they just sat there for like 6 weeks or so. Nothing happened. And I was just about to give up. I went home one day, and my student Donnie, I showed you there, called me at home and said, guess what? There's an adult emerging from one of these stems. So here is Oliver chewing his way out of and actually Oliver was a male, it turned out. Chewing his way out of the stem, squeezing out of that D-shaped exit hole, and there he is, alive and well. Okay, so what did we get overall? All of those 19 larvae that started out, we debarked those stems. We let them do this for a while. We tried to see how many adults would come out. We got 4 adults out. Once we decided to peel the bark, we found another pupa in there that was alive, and two larvae that had chewed their prepupal chambers and were alive. Okay, so that's, what's that, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 of the 19 larvae reached that stage of development, okay, which is basically success. Moreover, the adults that came out, fully formed adults, we fed them ash foliage, and they lived as long as an ash borer lives out here in the wild, okay? 37 days. All right, so, and again, remember, we took a lot of stems out of the experiment as we debarked them, and So we found larvae along the way, again, the pupa, adults, some prepupal larvae. 48% of all of the larvae that entered these olive stems survived until we took them out of the tree, which is quite high. That's a lot higher than you would see on Manchurian ash, their native host, for example. All right, those were just cut stems. That can be criticized. They're not actively growing intact trees. What can they do with live living trees? So here's a potted tree, like I showed you at the beginning, that stayed potted. And we inoculated a branch here. And I remember setting this up and sort of forgetting about this tree, just in a corner of the greenhouse. And then looking at it about, a month or so later and seeing all this dieback here and saying, wow, looks like something's going on in that part where we inoculated. And yes, indeed, if you carved into that, there was the feeding gallery of a fully mature fourth instar larva. And we dug deeper, and there's the larva in its prepupal form. We call that the J-shaped form because they're the shape of a J when they overwinter inside their prepupal chamber. And presumably, if we had taken this tree without debarking it, taken it through winter, quote winter, that would have come out as an adult in the following spring. So we have seen this, okay? They can get this far, or probably farther, on live living trees, which is important. And even if they don't, okay, even if the tree kills them, and the tree does kill a lot of them, okay, these live living trees are more resistant than those bigger stems, as it turns out. So here's a spot where there was a larva, but it got killed by the tree, but it got damaged enough that it induced the epicormic sprouting effect, right? So that did stress the tree, even if the larvae really didn't survive in this case. So we did some further studies on young live trees potted in the greenhouse at Wright State. And generally, we could say EAB larvae survive poorly on young live trees. Okay, they don't feed a lot, they don't get too far. We did find, though, that if the tree gets stressed by wounding, like bark wounding, that larvae do a little bit better. Okay, their establishment in the bark is high, at a higher rate. In their gallery, they feed longer before they end up dying. Okay, so wounding weakens the tree and so stress of maybe any sort kind of weakens the tree, makes them more susceptible. Same kind of thing we see with ash trees and white fringe trees. So wounding stress makes them do a little bit better. But overall, they don't do well on young live trees. Okay, that's the larva part. Okay, what about adults? What can they do with olive? Kathleen indicated that adults have to feed on foliage of ash for a few weeks before they can mate and lay eggs properly. So we asked the question, can they feed, mate, and lay eggs, viable eggs, on olive leaves? And if you know olive, if you've ever seen olive leaves, they're tough, right? They're evergreen, they're waxy, very tough. So we set up some tests, right? We put beetles in these little rearing containers with either ash foliage or olive foliage. And again, we made sure there were some males and females in there, right? And the top figure shows their survival through time. Okay, this is called a survival curve. And this is on olive, and this is on ash. And so you may not be able to see this very well, but by the end of this 34-day bioassay shown here, about 70% of the beetles that were fed ash were still alive at the end of that whole period. You can see they didn't do well on the olive foliage. Most were dead by 34 days. But adults really only need to feed for 2, maybe 3 weeks, 14 to 20 days or so to start to mate and lay eggs. And you can see that there was still some handful alive in that window. Some did make it 34 days, but there was a handful alive here in this window that lived long enough to mate and lay eggs. This is just like they're feeding on ash versus olive leaves through time. You can see they feed on leaves. They definitely feed. They didn't decline like this because they wouldn't eat it. The olive leaves are just not as high quality as ash leaves are. But this is the kicker. So here are a male and female EAB adults doing the thing. You can see the feeding damage they had done on the leaves. There's their frass. And they laid a viable egg that this little guy hatched out of that was living. Okay, so some handful lived long enough to feed and mate and lay viable eggs on only olive leaves. And remember, in nature, the beetles they can fly, right? So even if they have to eat olive leaves at some point, they can also fly over to a nearby ash tree and feed for a while and move around and that kind of thing. So this is like the worst case scenario when they have to feed only on olive leaves, and some of them can do it to this level. If you threw some ash leaves in the mix every now and then, they'd probably do even better, right? We could do that kind of test. None of this would matter if EAB don't lay their eggs on olive trees out in nature, right? This is all theoretical if the adults won't lay their eggs on it in the first place. So we looked at that. We looked at that like this. Took those same kind of trees. These are small trees, right? They're only about that tall. And this is taken out in a lawn at Wright State next to our woods. And this was done in 2017 and 18, I think, and published some stuff in 2018 on this. EAB densities were very low, by the way, by this time. Okay, so that's one thing to remember. Low beetles. There aren't many beetles out there. We didn't control that at all. We just put several of these potted trees out and looked at them every now and then to see, are we finding any EAB eggs being placed on these trees? And lo and behold, right here inside this circle on this particular tree, that round oval spot right there is an EAB egg that this guy came out of. Okay, so they indeed would lay some eggs on olive trees, even little trees only that tall, in a scenario where there are few beetles flying around at that point. Presumably, if there were lots of beetles, like at the peak of EAB, attack around here, they would have laid a lot more eggs on these things. I should also say now this phenomenon has been demonstrated out in Oregon on young olive trees as well, that EAB adults would lay eggs on olive trees out there as well. All right, more recently then, we also asked that question. I mentioned earlier that there are hundreds of cultivars, varieties of olive, that vary. You've seen them, right? There's little round ones, there's big fat ones. They taste a little bit different. Some are more bitter, some are less. Some of that chemical, like bitterness and such, we believe is part of the mechanism of resistance in olives and ash and fringe trees to EAB or other attackers of any sort. So we asked the question about how is there any variation among these cultivars in their susceptibility to EAB? This was a recent study. We collaborated with folks out in Oregon who sent us a handful of stems from 20 different cultivars of olive. So on this figure, if you just look at the one on the left here, these are just different cultivars. And this is their performance. We kind of just created a larval success ranking. It's not a percentage or anything like that. So the higher, the better. The higher these bars, the better. Again, overall, I can say that larvae did not do very well in this study. But the more important point from this study was that it was variable, however. Right? So there were some cultivars where they did okay. And there were some cultivars where they didn't do anything. So there was variation in susceptibility among these olive cultivars. So which could help management decisions, right? Which cultivars might be more at risk than others. This thing on the side just indicates that this may go along with variability in chemistry that we think is important for defense in these cultivars. Okay, now, this is a global problem, as I mentioned, right? I talked about how it's going to become a problem in Oregon soon, by next year maybe. The two will come into contact. Maybe already happening, I don't know. But it's a global problem. This is EAB in Russia and Ukraine. All these red dots are spots where EAB has been detected. And this is outside the native range. This is also an invaded area of EAB in European Russia and Ukraine. Right? So this is where it is right now, relatively recently. Or to study things in Ukraine right now. This is the native range of olive. Okay, and throughout, this is obviously the Mediterranean here, right? This is the Mediterranean basin. So this is the native range, but it is, of course, grown in areas beyond that, and including this little thing right here, that's Crimea. It's actually grown in Crimea, and there's some where was the Olympics a few years ago? Sochi. Okay, Sochi's right along here. There are olive trees in the Sochi area. And here's where EAB, that's the map I just showed you. This is where EAB is. So EAB is also going to start to contact olive trees in Crimea and in parts of European Russia here, working its way to the main growing regions of olive in the Mediterranean basin. And there it's going to be picked up and carried by ash species native to the Mediterranean basin. This is common ash, narrow-leaved ash, and manna ash in their ranges. That looks like a signal for me to wrap up, and I'm just about there. Okay? So my conclusions then from this olive part of things, and I just summarized this recently in a little review paper of all this data, just to kind of put it in one place. We saw that emerald ash borer can make it from egg to adult on at least this one cultivar that we studied intensely. While most die, larvae can feed on live trees, injuring them, and stress tends to improve their success, although they generally don't do very well. Some adults can feed long enough on the leaves to mate and lay eggs. And yeah, I guess that's here. And then the adults will oviposit on olive trees in the field, even when densities of them are low. So overall, with this olive thing, it looks like there is potential for EAB to utilize olive in some scenarios. Bigger trees, perhaps stressed trees, trees growing in unmanaged situations, right? Or poorly managed situations. There could be some risk, but it's probably not that great. That's kind of my conclusion right now. So this is just a little shameless advertisement, but I do this little, some of you know this little YouTube series. It airs on my local cable access channel in Yellow Springs. And I do a lot of interpretive walks and talks, 30-minute long sort of episodes. Take a look at it if you like it. Subscribe, follow. You know, it's kind of a public outreach thing I've been doing for a few years. Okay, with that, like Kathleen did, I have a whole host of people and places. This isn't even half of it, really, to be honest. To thank for all the data I showed you there. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Kathleen.
So I'm wondering about these emerald ash borers that manage to actually complete their life cycle on olive and create a larva. Have you taken the next step and looked at those larvae to see if they have a better success rate on olive? So if we're seeing natural selection kind of in action there.
No, short answer is no, we haven't. If you see that study, it was a pretty small study. I don't need to go back to it. A pretty small study. We did try this with white fringe trees, where again the idea would be if you continuously rear EAB on just these alternate hosts like white fringe tree or like olive, would you see through time them getting better at it, right? So the ones that can't do it die off, the ones that can do it survive and make it. Love to do that study. That's a long-term thing, and not yet. And I don't think anybody else has either. Cheryl? Yeah, Cheryl?
One is the emerald ash borer you were saying, had been said earlier, was that big, huge peak. And then now, where is it now as far as a peak or trough, as far as just in the general surrounding area? Now?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much like Kathleen described. It bottomed out I don't want to know exactly what year I'm going to put on it, but I would say though, because the young ash trees that were still out there relatively untapped grew back into attackable sizes, that the beetles are starting to come back up. But they probably will never reach the densities that we saw back in 2013 and such, because all those big ash trees that were producing thousands of beetles in some cases just aren't there to do that anymore. In fact, that might help that the ash trees or other things persist, because the beetle densities just may never get quite high enough to really do the same thing they did 10 years ago. So, how about here?
Oh, it's right
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I arrived a little late, but
Yeah.
what about autumn olive? Any possibilities there?
So I get this question regularly, and there are no possibilities there, because an autumn olive is not really an olive. It's in a completely different family, unrelated to cultivated olive and white fringe trees. So, however, privet is in this family, and people ask about privet. Privet, if you know, it makes a little fruit that looks like a little olive. There have been some tests, susceptibility tests with privet. It doesn't seem to be susceptible at all. So,
This is just a comment. Our Miamisburg Adena mound was covered in ash trees, and now it's a walled mound.
right, exactly, yeah. Well, certainly here, there used to be, these woods here were rich with ash trees. I mean, you all know it. And I'm sure there's some young ones out there still, and probably some treated trees still around, at least previously treated. And so, yeah, it's kind of sad what's happening there. I should add too, I decided not to talk about blue ash. We've also looked at blue ash. We've looked at it only, not like Kathleen's multiple site study, but 2 sites nearby, Wright State's Woods and Glen Helen, out in Yellow Springs. And we found patterns very much like Kathleen described, where in tests comparing mature white ash to mature blue ash, across the years that we studied it, all the white ashes went away, and the blue ashes are hanging in there quite well. We didn't see very much mortality at all, though, in our sites. Kathleen is seeing some mortality in some of their sites. So you can still see some big blue ashes out there. Yeah.
So that's our time. So if you have any other questions, please stick around, and we'll be here for a couple more minutes as well if you have any additional questions. Let's give them a big round of applause.